Welcome back to Telltale Books. This video I want to talk about a topic, something I'm going to do probably a series of topic videos on, and that is specific years that were significant. And in this case, it's a year significant more specifically to science fiction. The year, of course, is the beginning of the Golden Age, 1939. And when I do these videos and I talk about a specific year, it's really hard to say that it only encompassed 1 year or certain months of a year. It usually goes on for more than a year. It usually covers 2 to 3 years. And in this case, I would say it covers, well, of course, the Golden Age went on through the war years towards the end of the 1940s. The original Campbell Golden Age at Astounding. I feel like it kind of broke up around 1948. Some of the authors started going elsewhere and were doing other things, and Campbell got mixed up in some fake science pursuits and lost a lot of respect because of that. Plus, there were some other lucrative markets that came into existence. And 1938, most people will tell you July of 1938 was the month, that issue of Astounding, that's the beginning of the Golden Age. And you can probably make a pretty good argument for that because a number of excellent stories came out of that issue of Astounding. And the stories were of a new type of science fiction, but I really honestly believe that you can trace the beginning of this all the way back to Who Goes There by John W. Campbell. His own story. I feel that story was different from anything Campbell published before, and it was different from the majority of science fiction that was published before. It was a very different sort of creature. And a much stronger story, much better written story than anything else that had been published in the magazines before it. And that's what Campbell was looking to achieve when he took over editorship of Astounding. He was looking to find authors that would write a new type of science fiction that would be more focused on science and have some better writing than what had gone before. Now, most of the stories from today's viewpoint, you can nitpick a lot of the writing. They weren't great writers, but he was still dealing mostly with writers that they weren't trying to be John Steinbeck. They really wanted to be engineers and scientists, but they found these science fiction magazines with amazing stories and they got interested in it, and so they tried their own hand at it. Most of them still did go on to become scientists and engineers and weren't really full-time writers, weren't dedicated to trying to write great fiction. It was mostly a side thing that they enjoyed doing. Some of them did make it their full-time job, like Isaac Asimov. But as important as a lot of his stories are, nobody's going to tell you that Asimov is as good as Ernest Hemingway. There's nobody going to say anything like that. So, when you get into 1939, even before the July issue, and even outside of Astounding stories, there were some really excellent stories being written that kind of heralded this new wave of science fiction that came under Campbell's direction. A lot of them can be found in this book, The Great Science Fiction Stories. And if you follow our videos pretty closely, you've probably heard us talk about a number of stories that have come from this book. This is where I discovered about the Golden Age when I was a kid back in the 1970s. I had never heard of this until I got this anthology and read the introductions to the book talking about what was going on. So some of the great stories that come from 1939 are I, Robot by Ian Doe Binder, not to be confused with I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. Cloak of Aesir by John W. Campbell, that was published in March. The Day is Done was published in May. The Ultimate Catalyst by John Taine was published in June. Black Destroyer by A.E. Van Vogt was published in that July 1939 issue of Astounding, along with Greater Than Gods by C.L. Moore and Trends by Isaac Asimov. And then Theodore Sturgeon's first story, Ether Breather, came out in the September issue of Astounding. The Priestess Who Rebelled, Rust by Joseph Kalim, which I recently did a video on. So you can see there was quite a list of really great stories that were published in that year. But as I said before, starting in 1938, you had the publication in 1938 of Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis. In August of 1938, you had John Campbell's Who Goes There? And in December of 1938 was Helen O'Loy by Lester Del Rey. Definitely those stories, I feel, signified what was coming in science fiction. And my list here is by no means necessarily complete. You may have a favorite story that I'm not mentioning here. Moving on to 1940, a couple of really, and there's more than this. I haven't gotten into the Great Science Fiction Stories Volume 2 yet, but a couple of them that definitely come from Volume 2 are The Roads Must Roll by Robert Heinlein and Butyl and the Breather by Theodore Sturgeon. Both those stories came from 1940. And it was definitely a great year for literature in general, not just science fiction. 1939 saw the publication on April 14th of The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And on November 6th was published And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. And in 1940, For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. So you can see a lot of great things were going on in this time period. But especially within science fiction, like I say, you can't emphasize enough of so much of what was published before 1938, before Who Goes There, and even some of what was published after that time was just not very good. It was fun. It was interesting. There were some cool ideas and some weird aliens. And, for teenagers, it was, or preteens even, it was fun reading, but you just didn't have anything great. Well, I shouldn't say that. There were some great stories, but they were few and far between. The majority of the stories, from today's perspective, you read them, and it's hard to see how they even got published because they were just not very, very well written. pedestrian plots, cardboard characters. No real suspense to them. They were like comic books. But Campbell changed that. And he didn't overnight turn it into high literature. But he did make changes and make demands on his authors to turn in something better than what had been done before. And a lot of the older authors could not rise to that challenge, and so you saw them disappearing, at least from the pages of Astounding. They went and published in Planet Stories or Stirring Science Stories or Amazing Stories. They did not publish in Astounding because they just weren't of the Astounding caliber. And gradually they did fade out completely because the new generation of readers were expecting something a little bit better. And the older authors weren't delivering. Now, some authors made that transition very well. Jack Williamson and Clifford Simak are the two that stand out the most, who made that transition into the Campbell style of science fiction writing and wrote some classics. Jack Williamson with the Humanoids, and Clifford Simak with City, the whole series of stories that went together to make up the novel City. Brilliant stuff. So they were definitely able to adapt, but mostly it was the newer writers. And I'm going to do a video that goes at greater length sometime, because if you look at the Golden Age as a whole, and if you look at the past writing, which has focused so much on Astounding, and the authors that published in Astounding, a lot of those authors, yes, they did publish in Astounding, but if you look at their bibliographies, the majority of their work was published elsewhere. Like Theodore Sturgeon, most of his was published in Unknown. There were some others that were publishing a great deal of work in magazines like Planet Stories. Isaac Asimov himself, he published some stories in Astounding, but a lot of what he wrote during the 1940s was published in Astonishing or Amazing. And I feel his most productive period as a science fiction writer really came in the 1950s, where he was mostly publishing for Galaxy and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and others like that. So there are some myths about the Golden Age that make it sound like all the best work was in Astounding. And the reality is, no, it wasn't. The authors that did put some excellent stories in Astounding were mostly selling to other magazines and didn't really write that much for Astounding. I think if you look at Robert Heinlein and A. Van Vogt, most of their work was appearing in Astounding. And of course, that's two of the biggest names of the 1940s. They were the most popular writers. But most of the other writers that are identified with Campbell and Astounding, yes, they did publish stories in Astounding, but the bulk of their work was actually published elsewhere. And they wrote a lot of fantasies. Like Theodore Sturgeon is always considered a science fiction writer. But so much of his work was published in fantasy magazines like Unknown or Weird Tales, or Henry Kuttner too. He published so much work in Weird Tales. He published a lot in Astounding, especially in collaboration with C.L. Moore as Lewis Padgett. They published quite a lot of stories in Astounding. But there's just as much by both of them that was published elsewhere. So it doesn't change the fact, though, that 1939 was a game-changing year. And most of that game was being changed by the policies of John Campbell and the even writers like Isaac Asimov that were mostly not getting published in Astounding. They were still looking up to John Campbell and listening to what he was saying to them about how he felt science fiction should be done. And it caused a shift from stories where people were facing an alien invasion. Oh, let's just sit down for 5 minutes and we'll invent this whole new ray that when we turn it on, all the aliens will just disappear. Change from that to stories where scientific problems were posed and people had to actually spend time and figure it out. And the answer was not always obvious. Sometimes it took them time to figure it out. But in the end, the application of scientific principles would resolve that problem. It was a very, very scientific type of fiction. And I think that's why it is so much loved, because the people who really liked what Astounding was publishing were the people who were scientifically minded. They either worked as scientists or engineers, or they were at least very fascinated by it, and they wanted to read about science and not just read about, not just read technical articles, but to read fiction that involved science. They were fascinated by it and loved that fiction. So that's the first of what I've got. At least one more of these videos coming, and I think I can probably find some other banner years to talk about if I look closely. But the next one will be, again, 1953, but more than just 1953, kind of talking about the time period around that year, but that year kind of is central and the most important year in what happened. And so that's coming up. Thanks for listening to me about this, and we'll be back talking about more stories in the next video.